In a quiet little neighborhood where everyone seemed to know each other's business, there lived a man named Greg. He wasn't the kind of guy who threw big parties or tried to be the center of attention. Instead, he preferred keeping things simple and low-key. His life revolved around his small home, his trusty garage full of tools, and most importantly, his pride and joy and above-ground pool tucked away in his backyard. Greg had spent years saving up for that pool. It wasn't fancy or luxurious, like some of the ones you'd see in magazines, but to him, it was perfect. Every weekend, he'd grab a cold drink, hop onto his inflatable lounger, and float around while reading books or listening to music. The sound of water gently splashing against the sides of the pool gave him peace. To Greg, it wasn't just a pool. It was his escape from the chaos of everyday life. It was his personal slice of paradise. The neighborhood itself was typical suburbia rows of houses with neatly trimmed lawns, kids riding bikes on the sidewalks, and neighbors exchanging polite smiles as they passed by. But even in this seemingly calm setting, there was one person who stood out: Karen. If Greg was the quiet type, Karen was the exact opposite. She was loud, bossy, and always sticking her nose where it didn't belong. Some people called her HOA. Karen because she ran the homeowners association, like it was her own kingdom. Karen had been part of the HOA for as long as anyone could remember. She took her role very seriously, often walking around the neighborhood with a clipboard, jotting down notes about overgrown bushes, cars parked too close to driveways, or anything else she deemed against the rules. Most folks found her annoying, but they tolerated her because arguing with Karen usually meant endless drama, and no one wanted that. One sunny afternoon, Karen decided to take a stroll through the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched on top of her perfectly styled hair. As she walked past Greg's house, something caught her eye, a glimmer of blue peeking out from behind his fence. Curious, she stopped and peered into his backyard. There it was, Greg's pool, sparkling under the sunlight. At first, she just stared, tapping her pen thoughtfully against the clipboard. Then a slow smile spread across her face. For Karen, the sight of Greg's pool sparked an idea that would soon spiral into chaos. You see, Karen loved planning events. Whether it was a block party, a holiday gathering, or just a random excuse to bring the neighbors together, she thrived on organizing these get-togethers. And right now, the HOA was gearing up for their annual summer social. They needed a venue, and Karen suddenly realized that Greg's pool would be perfect for it. But here's the thing about Karen. She didn't ask nicely. Oh no, when Karen wanted something, she demanded it. So later that day, she marched straight to Greg's front door, knocked sharply, and waited impatiently for him to answer. When Greg opened the door, still wearing his gardening gloves and looking slightly confused, Karen launched right into her pitch. "Hi," she said without bothering with pleasantries. "I noticed your pool, and I think it would be great if we used it for the upcoming HOA summer event. What do you say?" Greg blinked, taken aback by her bluntness. Excuse me? This is my private property." Karen waved her hand dismissively, as if his words were irrelevant. "Oh, come on. Think of it as contributing to the community. We're all neighbors here. Don't you want to help make the event special?" Greg shook his head firmly. "No offense, but I worked hard for this pool. It's not exactly public property." Karen frowned, clearly unaccustomed to hearing the word no. Her voice grew sharper. "Well, technically, this is a shared community space. Besides, don't you care about neighborhood harmony?" Greg sighed, realizing this wasn't going to end anytime soon. He politely but firmly told Karen that he wasn't comfortable letting strangers use his pool. But Karen wasn't the type to give up easily. Over the next few days, she bombarded him with emails, phone calls, and even passive-aggressive flyers. slipped under his door, all insisting that he let the HOA use his pool. Each time Greg refused, Karen grew more determined. Eventually, she issued an ultimatum. Either he agreed to share his pool, or she'd report him to the city for violating some obscure zoning regulation. It was clear that Karen saw this as a battle she couldn't afford to lose, and poor Greg was stuck in the middle of her relentless campaign. Little did Karen know, Greg wasn't about to back down either. What happened next would leave the entire neighborhood talking, and Karen absolutely fuming. Karen wasn't the type of person to take no lightly. In fact, she hated it. To her, saying no was like committing some kind of social crime, especially when it came from someone in her neighborhood. So when Greg refused to let her use his pool for the HOA summer party, Karen didn't just shrug it off and move on. Oh no. She doubled down hard. At first, she tried to reason with him, thinking maybe he just needed a little more convincing. She sent him emails filled with bolded text and exclamation points, explaining how important this event was for community spirit. She left flyers taped to his front door, complete with pictures of smiling families gathered around pools. At other HOA events, she even called him multiple times a day, leaving voicemails that grew increasingly passive-aggressive. Greg, one message started sweetly before turning sharp. I really hope you'll reconsider letting us use your pool. After all, we're trying to build a sense of unity here. It's not about you, it's about the community. But Greg didn't budge. Every time Karen reached out, he gave her the same polite but firm response. It's my pool, and I'm not comfortable sharing it. He didn't yell or argue. He simply stood his ground. And while Greg stayed calm, Karen got angrier. The more he resisted, the more determined she became to get what she wanted. Finally, after days of failed attempts to sway him, Karen decided it was time to play hardball. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast long shadows across the neighborhood, she showed up at Greg's door again. This time, though, she wasn't carrying her usual clipboard. Instead, she held a folder thick with papers, looking every bit like a lawyer ready to drop a lawsuit. Greg, she began, her voice icy and clipped, you've left me no choice. If you won't cooperate willingly, then I'll have to escalate this matter. Greg raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms over his chest. Escalate what exactly? Karen smirked, clearly enjoying the drama she was creating. Well, according to our HOA guidelines and certain city ordinances, you're technically required to ensure your property contributes positively to the neighborhood's aesthetic and functionality. By refusing to share your pool, you're disrupting the harmony of the community. Greg blinked, trying to process what she was saying. Are you seriously threatening me because I don't want strangers using my pool? It's not a threat, Karen said smugly, flipping open the folder to reveal pages of highlighted text. It's a formal warning. Unless you agree to let us use your pool for the summer event, I'll be forced to file a complaint with the city. Trust me, they take these things very seriously. Greg felt a wave of frustration wash over him. He knew Karen was bluffing or at least exaggerating, but her words still stung. How could she twist something so personal into a rulebook violation? His pool wasn't just a feature of his backyard. It was something he'd worked hard for, saved up for, and cherished. It wasn't there to serve her agenda or anyone else's. Still, Greg didn't lose his cool. He looked Karen straight in the eye and said, Go ahead and file your complaint. But I'm not changing my mind. Karen's face turned red, her lips pressing into a thin line. For a moment, she looked like she might explode right there on his porch. But instead, she snapped the folder shut, spun on her heel, and stormed off, muttering under her breath about difficult neighbors. As the days passed, Karen's behavior only grew worse. She seemed obsessed with getting her way, almost like Greg's refusal had become a personal insult she couldn't ignore. She started showing up unannounced at his house, pounding on his door early in the morning or late at night. She parked her car outside his driveway and sat there for hours, watching his house like some kind of suburban detective. She even went so far as to ask other neighbors if they thought Greg was being unreasonable, hoping to rally support for her cause. Some people sided with her, at least outwardly, because they were tired of Karen's constant nagging and didn't want to deal with her wrath. Others, however, quietly admired Greg for standing up to her. They'd seen how Karen operated, steamrolling over anyone who dared challenge her authority, and they respected Greg for not backing down. A few even stopped by his house to offer words of encouragement. "You're doing the right thing," one neighbor told him one afternoon while Greg was tinkering in his garage. No one should have to give up their private property just because Karen wants it. Greg appreciated the support, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't going to stop until she got what she wanted. She was like a bulldozer, plowing through anything or anyone that stood in her path. And the more he thought about it, the angrier he became. Why should he have to compromise his peace just to satisfy her ego? One night, as Greg lay in bed staring at the ceiling, an idea began to form in his mind. It wasn't malicious or mean-spirited, it was clever. If Karen wanted his pool so badly, fine. She could have it, but not in the way she expected. The next morning, Greg woke up early and borrowed a sump pump from a friend who lived a few streets over. He set it up beside his pool and started draining the water. Bucket by bucket, gallon by gallon, the once clear blue basin slowly emptied, leaving behind nothing but damp plastic lining and soggy grass. By the time the sun rose high in the sky, the pool was completely dry. Greg stepped back and surveyed his handiwork with a satisfied grin. Let Karen come knocking now. If she wanted his pool, she could deal with the consequences. Sure enough, later that afternoon, Karen arrived at Greg's house, clipboard in hand, ready to claim her prize. She marched confidently toward the backyard, already imagining the scene. Tables set up around the pool, colorful decorations strung overhead, kids splashing happily in the water. But when she pushed open the gate and stepped into the yard, her jaw dropped. Instead of shimmering water, she found emptiness. Absolute emptiness. The pool was gone, or rather, it was still there, but completely drained, its hollow shell mocking her expectations. "What did you do?" Karen screeched, pointing wildly at the empty basin. "Where's the water?" Greg leaned casually against his fence, arms crossed, a hint of amusement playing on his lips. "Oh, hey," he said, feigning surprise. "I figured since you were so eager to use my pool, I should make sure it's available. Guess I forgot to mention it might need refilling first." Karen's face turned beet red, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You can't do this," she shouted, stomping her foot like a child throwing a tantrum. "This is sabotage. You ruined everything." Greg shrugged, pretending to think it over. Sabotage? I don't know about that. I just drained my own pool. Seems pretty reasonable. To me, this isn't over," Karen yelled, jabbing a finger in his direction. "You'll regret this." With that, she stormed off, leaving Greg alone in his backyard. He watched her go, shaking his head and chuckling softly to himself. Whatever happened next, he knew one thing for sure. Karen had finally met her match. Karen didn't handle disappointment well. In fact, she handled it like a toddler denied candy at the grocery store, loudly, dramatically, and with zero sense of proportion. So when she realized Greg had drained his pool just to spite her, she wasn't about to let it slide. No, this was personal now. To Karen, Greg's actions weren't just inconvenient. They were an outright declaration of war. The next morning, Karen stormed into the local police station, her clipboard clutched tightly in one hand and her phone buzzing incessantly in the other. She marched up to the front desk, her face flushed with indignation, and demanded to speak to someone in charge. When an officer finally approached her, Karen launched into a tirade that could rival a daytime soap opera. "That man!" she exclaimed, pointing toward the general direction of Greg's house as if the officer should already know who she meant. "He drained his entire pool, on purpose, just to ruin our HOA event. It's malicious destruction of property. He needs to be held accountable." The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by Karen's theatrics. "Ma'am, whose property? Is the pool?" Karen hesitated for half a second before snapping back. "Well, technically, it's his. But he did it knowing we needed it for the community event. That makes it vandalism against the neighborhood." The officer nodded slowly, scribbling something on a notepad. "I see. And do you have any proof that he damaged anything beyond draining his own pool?" Karen sputtered, caught off guard by the question. "Proof? Proof? Isn't it obvious? Look at what he did. He emptied the whole thing. That's practically criminal." The officer gave her a polite but firm smile. "Draining a pool isn't illegal, ma'am, especially if it's your own. I'll send someone over to talk to him, but unless there's evidence of actual harm or violation of laws, there's not much we can do." Karen left the station fuming, muttering under her breath about incompetent authorities and how no one understood the gravity of the situation. But she wasn't done, yet not by a long shot. If the cops wouldn't take action, she'd make sure the entire neighborhood knew what Greg had done. Word spread quickly in the neighborhood. By noon, nearly everyone had heard about Greg's drained pool and Karen's dramatic reaction. Some people thought it was hilarious. Others were shocked that Greg would go to such lengths to defy Karen. And then there were those who sided with Karen, convinced that Greg was being unreasonable and selfish. That afternoon, a small crowd began gathering outside Greg's house, curious to see how the situation would unfold. Neighbors whispered among themselves, speculating about what might happen next. Would Greg apologize? Would Karen escalate further? The tension was palpable, almost like everyone was waiting for the climax of a reality TV show. Sure enough, 2 police officers arrived shortly after, parking their cruiser near Greg's driveway. As soon as they stepped out of the car, Karen appeared from across the street, clipboard in hand, ready to provide her version of events. She followed them closely as they walked up to Greg's front door, eager to ensure her side of the story. Was heard loud and clear dot when Greg answered the door. He looked surprised but calm. The officers introduced themselves and explained why they were there, glancing occasionally at Karen, who hovered anxiously behind them. Without missing a beat, Greg invited them inside and offered to explain everything. "I drained my pool because I wanted to make sure it was available," Greg said matter-of-factly, leaning casually against his kitchen counter. "Karen kept insisting she needed it for the HOA party, so I figured, hey, why not? If she wants it, she can have it. Though I guess I forgot to mention it might need refilling first." One of the officers stifled a laugh, while the other nodded thoughtfully. "So, just to clarify, this is your private pool, correct?" "Yes," Greg replied. "I bought it, installed it, and maintain it myself. It's mine. And you drained it voluntarily?" the officer asked. "Absolutely," Greg said. "No coercion, no threats. Just me deciding what to do with my own property." The officers exchanged a glance, silently agreeing that there was nothing illegal about what Greg had done. They turned to Karen, who stood fuming in the corner. "Ma'am, unless there's evidence of actual damage or wrongdoing, this seems to be a private matter between neighbors. We can't intervene based on what you've described." Karen's jaw dropped. But he ruined the event." "He?" Sabotaged us. The officers shook their heads sympathetically but firmly. Again, ma'am, draining a personal pool isn't against the law. If you'd like to pursue legal action, you'll need to consult an attorney. For now, though, there's nothing we can do. With that, the officers thanked Greg for his cooperation and headed back to their cruiser. Karen lingered for a moment, glaring daggers at Greg before storming off in a huff, her clipboard clutched tightly to her chest. As the day wore on, the drama only intensified. Neighbors continued to gather outside Greg's house, some offering support, others simply there for the spectacle. A few even brought lawn chairs, turning the scene into an impromptu neighborhood watch party. Greg, for his part, tried to stay calm and composed, though he couldn't help but feel a mix of satisfaction and disbelief at how far Karen had taken things. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the crowd began to disperse, Greg sat on his porch with a cold drink in hand. He watched as Karen paced angrily in her driveway, ranting to anyone who would listen. Despite the chaos, Greg couldn't suppress a grin. For years, Karen had ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist, making life difficult for anyone who dared cross her. But this time, she'd met her match, and deep down, Greg knew he'd won. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't finished. She was the type of person who didn't give up easily, and Greg suspected this was far from over. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain. Greg had proven that standing up for yourself even in the smallest ways could make all the difference. The next few days in the neighborhood were anything but quiet. Word of Greg's drain pool and Karen's meltdown spread like wildfire, becoming the talk of every backyard barbecue, driveway chat, and grocery store run. People couldn't stop discussing it, some with laughter, others with disbelief, and a few with genuine concern about what might happen next. Karen, true to form, refused to let the matter drop. She was humiliated, furious, and determined to make Greg pay for embarrassing her in front of the entire community. It wasn't just about the pool anymore. It was about control. For years, Karen had been the unchallenged ruler of the HOA, enforcing rules real or imagined and micromanaging everyone's lives. But now, Greg had thrown a wrench into her carefully constructed world, and she wasn't about to let him get away with it. She started by doubling down on her campaign against him. Flyers appeared on neighbors' doors overnight accusing Greg of being anti-community and warning that his actions could set a dangerous precedent. She organized impromptu meetings at the local park, where she ranted about how Greg's defiance threatened the harmony of the neighborhood. She even went so far as to create a petition demanding stricter enforcement of HOA guidelines, a thinly veiled attempt to target Greg specifically. But not everyone was buying what Karen was selling. Many residents found her behavior over the top and ridiculous. Sure, some people still thought Greg was being unreasonable, but others began to see Karen for what she really was, a bully who thrived on drama. They whispered behind closed doors about how she always made mountains out of molehills and how this whole situation felt more like a power trip than a legitimate issue. Greg, meanwhile, tried to keep things low-key. He knew he'd stirred the pot, but he also believed he'd done nothing wrong. His pool, his decision, it was as simple as that. Still, he couldn't ignore the growing tension around him. Neighbors who used to wave politely from across the street now avoided eye contact, unsure which side of the feud they should take. Others stopped by his house unexpectedly, offering advice or encouragement, depending on their perspective. One evening, as Greg sat on his porch sipping coffee, an older neighbor named Bill approached him. Bill had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone else and was known for his no-nonsense attitude. He pulled up a chair without asking and plopped down beside Greg. "You've really got Karen fired up," Bill said with a chuckle, shaking his head. "I haven't seen her this mad since old Mr. Thompson painted his garage purple back in '98. Greg laughed despite himself. Yeah, well, I didn't think draining my pool would cause this much trouble. Bill leaned back in his chair, studying Greg thoughtfully. You know, most folks around here are too scared to stand up to her. They don't want the headache or the drama. But you called her bluff. Took guts. Greg shrugged, feeling a mix of pride and unease. I didn't mean to start a war. I just wanted her to leave me alone. Well, good luck with that. Bill said dryly, Karen doesn't give up easy. She probably tried to make your life miserable until she gets bored or finds someone else to pick on. As if on cue, Karen appeared at the end of Greg's driveway, clipboard in hand. She marched toward them with purpose, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. When she reached the porch, she glared at Greg, ignoring Bill entirely. This isn't over, she hissed, jabbing a finger in his direction. Mark my words, you'll regret crossing me. Greg sighed, setting his coffee mug aside. Look, I already told you I drained my own pool. End of story. There's nothing else to say. Karen's face twisted in anger. Oh, there's plenty to say. You're a selfish, entitled nuisance, and you're dragging this neighborhood down with you. People are talking, Greg. They're taking sides. And trust me, you won't like where this ends. With that, she spun on her heel and stormed off, leaving Greg and Bill sitting in awkward silence. After a moment, Bill broke the tension with a wry grin. She's something else, huh? Greg nodded, rubbing his temples. Yeah, something else. Despite Karen's threats, life in the neighborhood slowly returned to normal, or as normal as it could be under the circumstances. The police visit had put an official stamp on the situation, making it clear that Greg hadn't broken any laws. Without legal grounds to pursue him, Karen's options were limited, but that didn't stop her from trying to rally support for her cause. She began organizing more events, framing them as opportunities to restore neighborhood unity. At first glance, these gatherings seemed harmless enough potluck dinners, game nights, and gardening workshops. But it didn't take long for people to realize there were thinly veiled attempts to isolate Greg. Invitations went out to everyone, except him, and subtle jabs about team players versus lone wolves became common during conversations. Some neighbors played along, either out of fear of Karen's wrath or because they genuinely believed she was right. Others quietly sympathized with Greg, inviting him to casual hangouts or stopping by his house to check in. Over time, Greg noticed a shift in how people treated him. Before, he'd been the quiet guy who kept to himself. Now he was the guy who stood up to Karen, and whether they agreed with him or not, people respected him for it. Even the kids in the neighborhood started warming up to him. They'd gather near his fence after school, giggling and whispering about the infamous empty pool incident. One afternoon, a group of them mustered the courage to ask if they could play in the drained basin. Greg hesitated for a moment before nodding with a smile. Sure, go ahead, just be careful. Watching the kids laugh and climb around the empty pool brought a strange sense of satisfaction. In a way, Karen's obsession with using his pool for her party had backfired spectacularly. Instead of hosting some stuffy HOA event, Greg's backyard had become a playground for the neighborhood kids, a place where real joy and connection happened, unplanned and unforced. Still, Karen wasn't ready to admit defeat. Her final move came during the next HOA meeting held in the community center's cramped conference room. She arrived early, handing out printed agendas and ensuring everyone had a front row seat to her grand performance. When it was her turn to speak, she launched into a dramatic monologue about accountability, responsibility, and the importance of working together as a community. By the time she finished, several neighbors looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats and avoiding eye contact. But when Greg raised his hand to respond, the room fell silent, "Look," he began, his voice calm but firm. "I understand that Karen thinks I'm ruining the neighborhood by standing my ground. But here's the thing. My pool is my property. I worked hard for it, and I didn't drain it to hurt anyone. I did it because Karen wouldn't respect my decision to keep it private." He paused, letting his words sink in. If we're really talking about community values, then maybe we should focus on respecting each other instead of forcing people to do things they're not comfortable with. That's what unity looks like to me. The room erupted into murmurs. Some nodded in agreement, while others glanced nervously at Karen, who sat fuming in her chair. For the first time, cracks began to show in her carefully constructed facade. Her grip on the neighborhood was slipping, and everyone could see it. When the meeting ended, Greg walked out feeling lighter than he had in weeks. He knew Karen wasn't going to disappear overnight, but he also knew he'd planted a seed. Slowly but surely, the tide was turning, and for once, it wasn't in Karen's favor. Weeks turned into months, and life in the neighborhood began to settle into a new rhythm. The initial buzz surrounding Greg's drain pool eventually faded, replaced by the usual hum of everyday routines: kids riding bikes down the street, dogs barking in backyards, and neighbors chatting over fences. But beneath the surface, things had shifted subtly but unmistakably. Karen, once the undisputed queen bee of the HOA, found herself increasingly isolated. Her relentless campaign against Greg hadn't yielded the results she'd hoped for. Instead, it had exposed her true colors to many residents who had previously tolerated her behavior out of fear or indifference. Now, they saw her for what she was, a bully who thrived on control and drama. Her attempts to rally support dwindled, as fewer people showed up to her meetings or signed her petitions. Even those who still sided with her did so half-heartedly, more out of habit than conviction. The tide had turned, and Karen knew it. She tried to maintain her authoritative demeanor, but there was a noticeable crack in her confidence, a hesitance in her voice, a flicker of doubt in her eyes. Greg, on the other hand, became something of an unlikely hero. People who had once dismissed him as just another quiet neighbor now approached him with smiles and nods, eager to chat or share a laugh. Some even thanked him privately for standing up to Karen, admitting they wished they'd had the courage to do the same years ago. It wasn't fame or recognition Greg sought, it was simply respect. And now he had earned it. One crisp autumn morning, Greg decided it was time to refill his pool. He'd left it empty long enough to prove his point, and with winter approaching, he figured it was better to have it ready before the first frost hit. Borrowing the sump pump again, he spent the day filling the basin, watching as the water slowly crept up the sides until it sparkled under the sunlight once more. When the job was done, Greg stood back and admired his work. It felt good to see the pool restored, not because Karen might try to claim it again, but because it reminded him of why he built it in the first place: for peace, relaxation, and a little slice of happiness all his own. The following weekend, a few neighbors stopped by unexpectedly, carrying plates of cookies and bottles of soda. They said they just wanted to check in, though Greg suspected they were curious about the newly refilled pool. After some small talk, one of them finally asked the question everyone was thinking. "So, are you going to let anyone use it this time?" The neighbor joked, nudging Greg playfully. Greg laughed, shaking his head. "Not unless you're planning to throw me a party." The group erupted into laughter, and for a moment, everything felt lighter. No tension, no grudges, just people enjoying each other's company. Greg realized then that the pool wasn't just a source of joy for him anymore. It had become a symbol of something bigger, a reminder that standing your ground could lead to unexpected connections and a stronger sense of community. As for Karen, her reign as HOA dictator came to an abrupt end during the annual board elections. For years she had run unopposed, assuming her position was untouchable. But this time, several neighbors stepped forward to challenge her, citing the need for fresh leadership and a kinder approach. When the votes were tallied, Karen lost by a landslide. At first, she refused to accept the outcome, insisting there must have been some kind of mistake. But when no one rallied to her defense, not even her closest allies, she reluctantly stepped down. Over the next few weeks, she withdrew from neighborhood activities, spending most of her time indoors. Occasionally, Greg would catch glimpses of her peeking through her curtains, watching the world go on without her. It wasn't schadenfreude that Greg felt when he saw her like that. It was relief. Not because she was suffering, but because the neighborhood had finally broken free. From her grip, life wasn't perfect, of course. There were still disagreements and occasional squabbles, as there always would be. But without Karen stirring the pot at every turn, things felt calmer, friendlier, and more genuine. By spring, the neighborhood had transformed in subtle but meaningful ways. New traditions emerged, organized not by Karen but by ordinary neighbors, who simply wanted to bring people together. A monthly potluck dinner series became a hit, drawing families from all corners of the community. Someone started a gardening club, teaching kids how to plant flowers and vegetables. Even the annual summer social returned, this time held at the local park instead of anyone's backyard. Greg attended a few of these events, surprising himself by actually having fun. He wasn't the center of attention, nor did he want to be. But he enjoyed seeing how far the neighborhood had come since those tense days when Corinne ruled with an iron fist. People laughed more, argued less, and seemed genuinely happy to be around one another. One evening, as Greg floated lazily in his pool, sipping a cold drink and gazing up at the stars, he reflected on everything that had happened. What started as a simple act of defiance had grown into something much larger, a catalyst for change. He hadn't set out to make waves or become a neighborhood legend. All he'd wanted was to protect his peace and stand up for himself. Yet in doing so, he'd inspired others to do the same. For the first time in a long while, Greg felt truly content. His pool was full, his neighbors were friendly, and Corinne's shadow no longer loomed over the community. Sure, life would always have its challenges, but for now, everything felt right. And as the gentle sound of water lapped against the edges of the pool, Greg smiled, knowing he'd played a small part in creating a better, happier neighborhood, one splash at a time.